Chapter 9.
Who are you? Really? Isn't it obvious? I'm the leading man.
Ashalia promptly punched Balthier in the stomach, and Fran stepped in as he doubled over in pain.
What he means to say is it's none of your business. And this is none of yours,
said the princess.
You have your payment, leave us at once. What?
Asked Balthier.
And miss your homecoming.
Technically, it was not her homecoming, for they had just docked in Boujerbas aerodrome. The sun had already set as they neared the island, the fleet not bothering to interrupt its course to go on a wild goose chase across the open sky, and midnight now neared. Balthier had no trouble landing in the Imperial ship, though a public warning had already been issued with regards to Amalia's escape, and it was clear that Azelas wanted to see her to safety before the coming of dawn, but her argumentative side made this quite difficult, especially with Bosch and Balthier present.
Just because my uncle bought me out of incarceration, the princess growled, doesn't mean his intentions for Dalmasca are pure. Your Highness,
Bosch interceded,
he would not go through the trouble if he didn't have your best interests in mind. Oh, really?
She shot back.
You went through quite a bit of trouble that night in Nalbina, whose interests did you have in mind?
Quickly remembering how best to deal with her temper from his past years of servitude, Bosch met her aggression in tone.
Are you so stubborn as to blind yourself to the present in order to focus on the past? You took my father's life,
she sneered.
Why spare mine now? You would have me live in shame.
And this time he remained steady, allowing her the perception of dominance.
If that is your duty, yes.
Thankfully, his tactics worked, and rather than further aggravate the argument, she folded her arms and lowered her furor, addressing him with steely seriousness.
Perhaps you forget all that Andor has wrought. I do not forget, Majesty. It was by his counsel that we were able to free you. He may act in league with the Empire, but his heart is not. And what of your heart? Do you even have one? Will you two knock it off?
Azelas at last interrupted.
It is as he says. I ought not have kept Andor at so great a distance for so long a time. You were only being cautious,
Ashalia replied.
Just as I am now. Majesty,
Azelas pleaded,
Bosch was framed by the Empire, the only reason he still lives is to keep Andor obedient.
She unfolded her arms and placed a fist on her hip.
And in what ludicrous way does that work?
Azelas turned to Bosch in an impatient search for assistance, and the Landesian calmly explained,
Andor announced to Dalmasca citizens that I was executed. If they find that I am still alive, they will assume he is in league with Gramis. Well,
said the princess,
I can think of at least one way to easily remedy such a situation.
Balthier released a blunt laugh.
Damn! You're still here?
She questioned over her shoulder.
Best entertainment in town,
he replied.
Look,
Azelas continued exhaustedly, addressing the princess with pleading eyes.
For the last few days, our only thought has been your safety. We have no plans yet for dealing with Vayne, and certainly none for dealing with you, if you'll forgive my tone. Highness, I need more time, just a day or two. On our own, we struggle in vain to restore Dalmasca, and once the Emperor hears that you're alive, he will be that much more determined to destroy us. You're leaving,
she growled with an accusing glare.
We can't just put you on the throne and declare 2 conquered countries yours,
Azelas defended.
I must search out some other way, and until I should find it, I would have Bosch remain at your side. Doubt him you may, but I measure his loyalty to Dalmasca no less than my own.
Ashalia released a contemplative sigh, and Balthier rolled his eyes.
Boring. Somebody hit him,
the princess growled. Fran obliged, delivering a fair smack to the back of his head, and he shot her a glare.
Ow! I know you would not speak so lightly,
Ashalia sullenly told Azelas.
I have placed my life in your hands, and if you choose to place it in another's, who am I to argue? I knew you would understand,
he replied with a smile.
Just don't kill him, he comes in handy from time to time.
She gave his arm a sad, playful slap.
Sort of like you. I am certain the local resistance will welcome you, but I would rather you wait for me here.
He returned the gesture to her shoulder with less force.
Andor will keep you safe.
She nodded.
I understand.
With an expression of gratitude and a silent farewell, Azelas walked away, leaving Ashalia with a momentary look of abandonment on her face. Vaughn and Penelo both took a studious interest in this, as they did in all aspects of their princess, but she did not maintain the expression for long. Bosch stepped to her side.
Ash! Listen, she snapped. I trust Azelas, not you. If I suspect for even a moment that you are working for Arcadia... I've heard this all before, Highness. Now how long do you intend to keep the Marquis waiting?
Giving him a final grey-eyed glare of warning, she turned with a huff and headed for the exit, leaving him to follow at her heels.
Leaving so soon?
Balthier asked.
Fortunately, yes, she answered. Would it kill you to follow suit? It might.
He gave Fran a nod.
Come on, Fran. Let's get wasted and pretend we own the place. Again.
Fran replied, following him as he headed in the direction opposite of the princess.
Kids,
he called out over his shoulder,
if you want a sane ride back to Robinaster, you know where to find us.
Vaughn and Penelo glanced to each other uncertainly, then looked at the two retreating pairs. They resigned to immobility, deciding to remain with the Strahl, as such a tactic was likely their best bet for returning home safely. The Marquis had been expecting Ashalia and Bosch, though he could not meet them immediately as the last of his imperial guests had not yet departed. Servants in trust of the resistance welcomed them to the estate and led them to Andor's office so that they could await his arrival in safety, though both remained preoccupied with each other to a far greater extent than with the prospect of imprisonment. Ashalia for the most part ignored Bosch, though he knew this to be her way of preventing her tongue from slipping, and thus he kept his distance, despite his inherent urge to beg her forgiveness and explain the circumstances that had led to their current positions. He knew, however, that she was in no mood to entertain such explanations, and wouldn't be until she herself brought it up. His limp had nearly disappeared, but as he walked at her side, he could tell she had taken notice of it. She had ever been wary of those who protected her, not out of distrust, but out of concern for their well-being, but Bosch did not expect to earn her concern any time soon, for even should he be proven innocent in the king's murder, he was the man who fought at her husband's side in Nabudis, the man who let Prince Rasler die. She had not held him accountable at the time, mainly because of the depth of her sorrow and the severity of his injuries. In fact, she had stuck up for him, while her father told her that he would be given a commanding position in the army upon his recovery. She had simply stared at the floor and stated that he would join her cortege. Azelas had told him this in the infirmary, making it clear that he had no choice, for back then they had known each other better, a true pair of war horses, and Azelas had easily recognized Bosch's utter loss of confidence in his own ability to protect those he loved. But when the chance to redeem himself presented, he failed once again. The 2 years he spent in Nalbina remained nothing more than a blur of mud, blood, and misery in his mind. At the time, every day had seemed a month, yet in hindsight, he could recall few details of his detention. Indeed, the time he remembered added up to only a few weeks. He remembered weeping upon learning of Ashalia's suicide, and then the feeling of childish silliness that overcame him when hearing of Captain Vossler's reappearance at the site of a supposed Dalmascan knight, Amalia. His brother's visits provided a grudging comfort, if only because he so missed hearing Landesian spoken to him. Sometimes they hated each other, sometimes they managed to ignore the past, but they had always been able to speak civilly of their respective charges, taking pride in how much trouble their princes could cause. Even with Rassler gone, he did feel a certain pride that came along with protecting royalty, even if he had failed to do it. This opportunity, however, carried with it the chance to reclaim his dignity, though he predicted it would be far more difficult than watching over Rassler had ever been, for Ashalia was nothing like he remembered her. She had been happy in those days, her eyes had shone brighter, and her countenance beamed with innocence. He had barely even recognized her on the Leviathan. She had cut a good 2 or 3 feet of her hair off, and where it had once been scooped up in a ponytail atop her head, draping down and flowing with her skirt, it now hung loose around her face, barely brushing her shoulders. Oddly, he took particular notice that she still wore her wedding ring. She and Rassler shared a true and endearing friendship, this he knew, but he didn't recall them ever being in love. Feeling the thickness of the air between them as they waited in the dim room, he at last glanced down at her, careful not to draw her attention, and spoke, "You look good with short hair."
"Thank you,"
she replied shortly. After a tense pause, she added,
"What's wrong with your leg?" "Nothing that won't fade with time."
Another pause followed. All at once the princess shoved Bosch violently against the wall.
"You son of a bitch! Just don't quit, do you?"
he groaned.
"You never said anything about having a brother,"
she went on, slapping his shoulder a few times. In his own defense, he caught hold of her flailing arms and stilled them, though not without worry that his grasp may bruise her delicate skin.
"We haven't been on cordial speaking terms since the fall of Landis,"
he explained as calmly as he could.
"For God's sake, why not? He accepted Arcadian rule and I joined the resistance."
She gave him yet another suspicious glare, but there appeared in her eyes a fleeting wisp of emotion, as though she truly longed to believe him. But both knew that she could not allow herself such susceptibility without solid proof.
"He is a judge,"
Bosch continued, releasing her wrists,
"ordained as Gabranth. He and Judge Drace manage Lamont's security."
She hesitantly folded her arms and took a few steps away from him, hugging her frame almost vulnerably and glowering down at the floor.
"A judge? I would not be so presumptuous as to expect you to believe it without proof." Lamont seemed to believe it. "He mustn't ever know about Nalbina." "If what you say is true, then his bodyguard is a cold-blooded killer,"
she retorted.
"Why should he not know that?" "Forgive me for saying so,"
Bosch sighed,
"but your greatest flaw is your insistence on thinking in absolutes. Gabranth loves Lamont like a son, he would have done anything to maintain his position in his cortege. And for that you can forgive him." I can try.
He held her gaze for a moment before looking behind her to the opening door.
Marquis. Captain.
Ashalia turned quickly to see that her uncle had indeed arrived, and spoke with a heavy breath of indiscernible emotion.
Uncle Halim. Ash.
He smiled with seemingly exhausted uncertainty, drawing nearer but not daring to embrace her as he would have done before the war.
I tried not to get my hopes up, but...
At his loss for words, the princess merely nodded.
It's good to see you, too. I hope you will forgive us for not telling you sooner,
said Bosch.
We weren't entirely sure where your allegiances lie,
Ashalia added. He nodded understandingly.
I hope it is more than obvious now. It is,
said the princess,
but we've got other worries to tend to. Of course.
Bosch nodded his courtesies and headed for the door.
I'll be waiting. Don't bother,
Ash replied as he stepped out, letting the door shut softly, leaving in his wake a finalizing silence.
Then you don't trust him, either?
The Marquis asked at length.
No, but Azelas does. For the time being, I don't have much of a choice. I see. Then Azelas was in on this as well. It was his idea from the beginning,
she said with a mild nod.
Everyone assumed him dead after the Nalbina incident, so he brought me with him.
Andor's voice softened briefly, despite his best efforts to strengthen it.
You were buried.
Ashalia's did not falter.
He dug me up. Ash, how could you abandon your country in its time of need? What other options were there? I'd be of less use dead than weak.
Finally, he found the solidity he sought and spoke in the tone of a true public official.
Weak, indeed. I don't need a lecture, Uncle,
Ashalia snapped back.
I know when I am beat. At this point the resistance is dependent solely on you. On me. Your money, your influence, your connections to the Empire. All becoming more and more limited as the seasons turn. Marquis, we are running out of support as it is, we can't afford to lose you, too. What matter is losing me if you have been gained?
She shook her head.
Just because I am a valid heir doesn't mean I am powerful. Besides, our gain has already been matched, we didn't even know that Gramis had a fourth son. And that is how it must stay.
Upon catching the irreverent glare she cast his way, he explained as best he could.
At such an age, he could be easily kidnapped, and the wrath that such an act would incite. Dalmasca will not sink so low. You speak too freely on behalf of your people. You've met the boy, yes.
Suppressing a sigh of frustration, she nodded.
You know his nature,
the Marquis explained.
But those who work in the resistance will consider him nothing more than a tyrant in the making. The Emperor has gone to extreme measures to ensure that Master Lamont remains non-existent outside of Arcadia and but a rumor within. Then surely he must trust you if he has disclosed such a secret to you,
she insisted.
It was purely by accident that I met the prince. Accident?
She demanded, regretting her tone.
He stowed away on a research vessel 3 years ago,
Andor answered with a sigh.
No matter how much security his father provides, he always gains the upper hand. Then any wayward resistance fighters would meet great difficulty in taking him hostage. Ashalia, this is a war. For God's sake, don't bring children into it. I would never do him any harm, but I am running out of options. In case you haven't noticed, we need all the help we can get. And yet in 2 years you have made no attempt to contact me,
he charged.
Did you truly expect me to, given your actions as of late?
She shot back.
My actions would not be necessary if you had assumed your throne when the time was upon you. Gramis would have killed me. I would have aided you. Boujerba was strong then. We could have allied with Rosaria. And what then?
Her eyes had grown colder, she thought, but for once she felt grateful for it.
Arcadia would win, and we'd be worse off, or Rosaria would win and use its new power to conquer us. There is no logic in allying with an empire. And you see logic in allying with an empire's playground. Halim, we are past all this. Isn't it enough that I've come to you now? Boujerba must stand with us.
Ando released a sigh and shook his head, then reached out to his niece and gingerly brushed some hair from her face.
My little Lady Ash,
he said, seeking any semblance of the child he had known so long ago.
When you were a girl, your only wish was to be carried in my arms. You are a woman grown now, and it seems your wishes have grown proportionately.
A glint of hope sparked in her eyes, sending a brief flash of blue over the impenetrable grey.
Then Boujerba will aid me?
She asked. He regarded her briefly before answering.
Suppose for a moment you were to defeat Gramis, what then? You would have Vayne to deal with, and then Lamont. They are at least fair-minded. They are sons of Solidor, warriors, renowned military geniuses.
He folded his hands behind his back and began to pace.
And even should you defeat them, would that not level you with Arcadia? Would it not provoke Rosaria to strike you down out of fear? You misunderstand, uncle. I do not wish for war. I want only my own lands back. I will not go on to conquer out of vengeance. Easy words to say, my dear, but a difficult promise to keep. Even should you mean it, you cannot simply rebuild your kingdom with the only proof of your birthright stolen. Without that, the Grand Kiltias on Baromises cannot and will not recognize you as the rightful heir. You may yet be a princess, but without proof of your identity, you are powerless. You will remain with me, we do nothing until the time is right. I cannot just wait. Then what does your majesty propose we do? Uncle Halim. This is the only aid I can offer you, Ash. My hands are just as tied as yours.
Ash struggled to subdue the tear-jerking lump in her throat, but knew that her uncle spoke the truth. For all her dedication and all her determination, she admittedly held very little power, and to act on her impulse now would do nothing more than compromise what fleeting power she did possess. The princess was by no means fond of giving up, but she nevertheless recognized when no other path could be taken. Accepting her uncle's invitation to stay with him rather than with the local resistance faction, if only because she felt safer with him than with Bosch, she soon found herself in a perfumed chamber that rendered her housing over the last 2 years downright barbaric in comparison. A painful sense of nostalgia overcame her as she stood at the center of the room, as she had always stayed in it when visiting her uncle in years past. Strangely, it comforted her to know that Bosch would sleep in the room across the hall, just as he had when she and Rassler were together. Of course, Azelas usually slept next door, which had never made much of a difference until now. He had always been her favorite, a member of her cortege for nearly 20 years, the head of her security for nearly 12. In all that time, there had been only 3 people he had ever trusted to be left alone with her: her mother, her husband, and Bosch. She could not recall how many times she had scolded him for his unrelenting wariness, how often she had questioned why he did not trust her father or her uncle or even the other members of her cortege so deeply, but he never humored such inquiries, insisting that caution was the heart of his job. Even as he trained her to take on her undercover identity, he had seen to her safety. He introduced her to the troops as a general he had served on the Nubratsia/Landis border, claiming her bravery to be incomparable, but through his act she could see the fear that plagued him for exposing her to the dangers and horrors of the military, and thus she worked to ease his anxiety by becoming the best soldier he had ever seen. Living like a commoner for the past 2 years indeed seemed to have hardened her, but she hadn't noticed until now, as she stared at the great fanciful bed before her, not too very different from the bed she had shared with Raslur. The thought almost got a smile out of her. All too clearly could she remember standing side by side, staring at their bed, weakly trying to come up with excuses. She remembered being lectured the next day by her mother-in-law, while her father did the same to her husband. It had all been about alliances and heirs, of course, but the 17-year-old bride and groom had been completely oblivious to this. She remembered Bosch and Azelas, hung over from the wedding, how she cried to them, wishing she hadn't agreed to the marriage, not that it would have made a difference. Never before had she been so embarrassed.
Good,
Azelas had said.
I don't have to kill him after all.
That afternoon they left for Nabudis, where she would spend the majority of her married years, and Raslur's parents had been most surprised to hear that he and Ash had decided not to join their security forces, that Bosch and Azelas would run things jointly, just as they had before the wedding, for truly, given the nature of their marriage, nothing had changed. In hindsight, they truly were good knights. At times it seemed as though they were the only ones in the world who never asked why Dalmasca and Nubratsia even bothered with the treaty, why the prince and princess never kissed or even held hands in public, why she wasn't pregnant. Azelas had first been assigned to her when she was only 6 years old. She'd had such a crush on him, she remembered, the only man in her cortege who wasn't old and boring and scary. He hadn't ranked high, then, but he did his job well enough to earn the appreciation of both Ash and her father, and thus he ascended to the highest position in her security by the time she turned 14. He protected her without smothering her, let her get in trouble without getting hurt. He loved her without controlling her. Bosch had, over time, become a good friend. Raslur had never been one to keep a guardian for long, too rambunctious and free-spirited, but Bosch had recognized this from the beginning and the two got on famously. When Ash and Raslur planned to make mischief, Azelas and Bosch had been the only knights who could be trusted to not only keep their mouths shut, but even on occasion cooperate. As Ash remembered, they had been quite wary of each other at first, though their relationship had always been a mildly competitive one. But they were friends, she knew, and Azelas trusted him. Now, if only she could bring herself to do the same. It seemed she had become a little too hardened in the last 2 years. Her recent life had focused on fencing and politics and putting up a tough act for her troops, and while she had grown to respect the bond between soldiers, she could not bring herself to trust Bosch as she did Azelas. It occurred to her then that perhaps her soldier's instinct was of little use anymore, and she might do well to take her bodyguard's word over her own muddled emotions. But even this she found too difficult to accept, having fit herself in the role of leader a bit too well. But she could acknowledge her new position. She was no longer a general, once again, she was a princess. and a princess would not tuck herself into a voluptuous bed and sleep while her country suffered. Stopping not even to change out of her high-class Arcadian garb, she stole out of the room and down the stairs to the scullery, where she accurately remembered there being a ground-floor window with a broken lock. No doubt Monty had made good use of this as well. Once off of the estate, she headed straight across town to the aerodrome, lending little thought to what she left behind. Vaughn and Penello, meanwhile, passed their time waiting around the aerodrome for Balthier and Fran by telling of their respective adventures over the course of the last few days, and when they spied a shadow sneak into the straw, they followed promptly, figuring their ride to be departing without them. They certainly did not expect to find their princess at the controls, struggling with growing frustration to deactivate the security lock.
"What are you doing?"
Penello asked a tad urgently. Ash looked up briefly, but then returned her stoic gaze to the control panel.
"I'm going to find the midlight shard. I'll return the ship later." "Are you crazy?"
Vaughn asked.
"I don't have time to wait for Azelas," she insisted. "This is something that I have to do. He'd let me if he were here." "So you're gonna go off by yourself?"
Vaughn pressed.
"I'm the only one who knows where it's hidden. There's no point in bringing others into this."
Vaughn shook his head.
"Don't you have any idea what the Emperor will do when he finds out you're alive? He'll send out his pathetic fleets like he always does. I will not be made to hide, I'll fight alone if I must." "You still have Bosch, right?"
said Penello.
"I'd rather not. And besides,"
Vaughn added,
"you can't just go around stealing people's ships." "Who are you to talk of stealing?" "Hey, come on. I just didn't want the Dusk Shard in the hands of the Arcadians." "And where is it now?"
He leaned back with a groan, trying not to roll his eyes at his princess and failing.
"I did it for Dalmasca, okay?" "Well, I'm doing this for Dalmasca," she snarled, "so either help or get lost." "Why are you so damn cold all the time?" "I'm trying to concentrate."
Suddenly, Balthier's voice boomed over the ship's intercom.
"That's quite enough, Your Majesty."
All three turned to the back of the cockpit to see both pirates standing expectantly in the doorway. Balthier held up the mobile comm link that had enabled him to eavesdrop on their entire conversation.
"What do you think? A bit over the top?"
she sneered.
"I'm just borrowing it." "Like hell you are."
He stepped in and put the comm link back in his pocket.
"Go borrow one of your uncle's ships." "I tried. They're all locked." "Tough luck. I'm leaving and you're staying." "You can't."
She stood abruptly, more hurt than angry.
"Trust me," he said. "You're better off here." "I am useless here," she insisted. "The Marquis just wants to protect me, he thinks I'm a child." "Well, you certainly do have a tendency to act like one."
The hurt dissipated and the anger resurfaced.
"Hey." "Sorry, Highness," he went on. "We have too much on our hands to continue holding yours."
Penello stepped forward timidly, pained to see her princess helpless.
"Well, Balthier,"
she offered.
"Suppose you kidnapped her instead?" "No thanks," he scoffed. "I just spent 3 weeks clearing my name." "But you're a sky pirate, aren't you?"
Ash added with a new light in her eyes.
Just steal me. Is that so much to ask?
He smiled.
What do you have that I would want? The Dynast King's treasure.
She paused for a moment, having blurted it out with little thought, but upon seeing that both pirates, even Vaughn and Penelo, had perked at the mention of such a thing, she went on with a stronger voice.
The Midlight Shard is in King Rythwal's tomb, along with all of the riches of his lifetime.
Balthier glanced at Fran for approval, then folded his arms and turned cunningly back to the princess.
King Rythwal, hey? You know, you don't seem like the type to sell off all of your forefathers' wealth in exchange for a free ride and one little rock. That little rock will put me on the throne,
she said.
Then she'll have all of her own father's wealth,
Vaughn added.
Good point.
He smiled.
All right, princess, consider yourself stolen. Thank you.
Before he could further frustrate her, Bosch spoke up from the cockpit door.
Balthier, are you completely insane? No,
Balthier groaned.
Just slightly. Kidnapping royalty is a serious offense,
Bosch continued as he approached the clearly not amused Ashalia.
It won't do much to keep further bounties off your head. How much is the price on your head these days, I wonder?
Balthier shot back.
Captain, said the princess, you know as well as I do that we are powerless without proof of my lineage. That I do, he answered, and I have no intention of interfering. But Azelas will have my head if anything should happen to you, so I'm afraid if you intend to go running off with a bunch of pirates, I must insist that you allow me to escort you in his place. I don't need a babysitter. Tell that to Geese.
She glowered at him as a cat regards an empty food dish, but he continued undaunted.
You don't trust me, that's understandable. Until you no longer feel the need to keep me at a distance, why don't you let Vaughn look after you?
Vaughn's eyes widened.
Hey! You know he's in it for Dalmasca,
said Bosch. Ash shortly looked the boy up and down, then at last relented.
All right. Hey, he injected, don't I get any say in this? You're protecting your princess,
Bosch replied.
Isn't that every patriot's dream?
Vaughn hung his head exhaustedly.
Well, okay. But Penelo's coming with us. Good idea, said Balthier. She's got friends in high places.
Penelo cast him a glare.
Shall we leave then? Asked Fran, or is there something yet left to argue over?